For half a century, the Dutch left the door open on almost everything. Legal cannabis since 1976, the world's first same-sex marriage in 2001, legal euthanasia in 2002, and now one gate is closing. In August 2022, a baby died outside an overflowing asylum center in Ter Apel. In July 2023, the government collapsed over migration. By December 2024, police were checking papers at the German and Belgian borders again. The Netherlands runs migration like a canal lock, not an open sluice. So how does Europe's most tolerant country choose who enters? That question has an answer, and it starts long before anyone worried about asylum seekers. The Netherlands built its reputation for tolerance the way it built its land, deliberately, with engineering, not by looking away. This is a country that has spent centuries managing water through dikes, polders, and locks rather than damming every river or flooding every field, and it governs people the same way it governs water. In 1976, the government formalized gedoogbeeleid, the policy that let coffee shops sell cannabis openly while cultivation and wholesale supply stayed illegal on paper, a contradiction Dutch officials chose to live with rather than resolve by force. Roughly 570 licensed coffee shops operate under that framework today, each bound by a municipal permit capping how close it can sit to a school. In 2000, lawmakers lifted the ban on brothels, pulling sex work out of back alleys and into a licensed industry with health checks, contracts, and labor protections. In 2001, the Netherlands became the first country to open marriage to same-sex couples, a change most of the rest of Europe would spend the next 2 decades catching up to. Some still haven't. The first 4 couples married just after midnight on April 1st, 2001, in an Amsterdam ceremony performed by Mayor Job Cohen, among them Anne-Marie Thus and Helene Fossen. In 2002, it became the first nation to legalize euthanasia, writing a legal path for doctors to end suffering under strict medical review boards rather than secrecy and guesswork. Regional review boards logged 9,068 reported euthanasia cases in 2023 alone, each one checked afterward against strict due care criteria rather than approved in advance. None of these 4 laws came from a single government or party. They landed across different coalitions over nearly 3 decades, part of why the reputation stuck. None of this was chaos. The caricature of Dutch tolerance as a free-for-all is wrong. Every one of those laws replaced an unregulated gray zone with a system of permits, oversight, and enforceable boundaries. That is the trick people miss about Dutch tolerance. It was never the absence of control. It was control aimed at letting people live as they chose, inside lines the state drew and enforced. Extend those same lines to people crossing the border, and you get the Netherlands' post-war approach to asylum. It joined the Schengen area in 1995, tearing down checkpoints with Belgium and Germany and treating free movement as a settled fact of daily life. The Netherlands had actually signed the original Schengen Agreement a decade earlier, in 1985, alongside France, West Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, one of 5 founding signatories. It stood behind the 1951 Refugee Convention, the founding document of international asylum law, applying it without the reservations or opt-outs some neighboring governments quietly built in. Asylum seekers who arrived were funneled into COA, the state reception agency, which spread new arrivals across small towns and cities nationwide rather than concentrating them in one place. A deliberate design to share the load, one other European governments later studied as a model. COA, established in its modern form in 1994, has run as many as 700 reception locations at once in peak years, from converted barracks to a cruise ship moored in Velsen. When Europe's migrant crisis peaked in 2015, roughly 58,000 people filed asylum applications in the Netherlands in a single year, and the country absorbed it without the surge becoming a flashpoint, unlike elsewhere on the continent. For decades, the operating assumption behind Dutch asylum policy was not caution. It was welcome. Officials built shelters and processing centers designed to take people in, not to filter them out at the gate. That assumption held for a very long time, through crisis after crisis, without the reception system itself becoming the story. It was not going to hold forever. It stopped holding at a single reception center in the country's northeast. Ter Apel is the Netherlands' main national registration point, the first stop for almost anyone applying for asylum, built to process roughly 2,000 people at a time. A figure planner set assuming steady turnover, not backlog. The village around it counts fewer than 4,000 residents, an unlikely bottleneck for a system meant to process tens of thousands of applicants a year. By August 2022, it was holding more than 3,000, and the excess had nowhere to go. The municipalities meant to take overflow were themselves full or refusing new arrivals. The IND, the Immigration Service processing claims, was by then sitting on a backlog of more than 30,000 unresolved cases, each week of delay adding another body to the line at Ter Apel's gate. Hundreds slept outside on the grass and stacked plastic chairs because the beds ran out, in a country wealthy enough that the image read as a policy failure, not a resource shortage. That same month, a 3-month-old baby died at the overcrowded center, a death the National Ombudsman's office would later tie to conditions it called inhumane, language a government watchdog does not use lightly. A welcoming system does not produce a dead infant outside its own front gate. Photographs of families sleeping in the open at a Dutch facility traveled well beyond the Netherlands, landing hard because they contradicted decades of the country's own broadcasting about itself. Ter Apel was the moment the gap between what tolerance promised and what the system could deliver stopped being a policy debate conducted in ministries and became a body count of one, covered on the evening news. A canal lock that jams does not just slow the water, it floods the control room. And that is close to what happened next in The Hague. On July 7th, 2023, Prime Minister Mark Rutte's fourth cabinet collapsed, ending a run that had made him one of the EU's longest-serving leaders since he first took office in 2010. That fourth coalition paired Rutte's VVD with D66, the CDA, and the Christian Unie, a 4-party alliance that had itself taken a record 299 days to assemble after the 2021 election. The trigger was narrow but loaded, a fight over capping family reunification, the right of recognized refugees to bring spouses and children to the Netherlands. Rutte's coalition partners could not agree on where that cap should sit, some pushing for a hard limit, others refusing to restrict it for recognized refugees. And the government fell rather than paper over it. Rutte announced he would leave national politics, a striking exit for a leader who had outlasted 4 American presidencies and 5 German chancellors, undone by a fight over migration numbers that would have been a footnote 4 years earlier. He didn't disappear for long. Within a year and a half, he was running NATO, becoming the alliance's Secretary General. Proof a fight over asylum caps can end a domestic career without ending a political one. He was sworn in as NATO Secretary General on October 1st, 2024, succeeding Jens Stoltenberg. It was no longer a footnote once voters got their say. Migration had climbed to the top of Dutch voter concern before the election, ahead of housing and healthcare. And on November 22nd, 2023, Geert Wilders' PVV won the national election outright with 37 seats, more than any other single party, capping nearly 2 decades of Wilders building the party from the opposition benches. That was more than double the 17 seats the PVV had won 2 years earlier in 2021, the sharpest single election swing in the chamber's modern history. It was the first time an explicitly anti-immigration party had topped a Dutch parliamentary vote, stunning an establishment that had spent years treating Wilders as a permanent opposition figure, not a plausible governing partner. Dutch elections run on pure proportional representation, so no single party ever wins a majority outright, and coalition math involves several parties. The Dutch parliament seats 150 members, so a governing majority requires at least 76, a threshold no post-war Dutch party has ever reached alone. Forming a government took nearly 7 months of talks, among the longest in Dutch political history, because no mainstream party wanted to hand Wilders the reins, and every combination excluding the PVV failed to add up to a working majority. The country spent the better part of a year without a functioning government while parties negotiated how far to let the election result reshape policy. They found an arrangement eventually. A coalition of the PVV, the Free Market VVD, the centrist NSC, and the Farmers Movement BBB was sworn in on July 2nd, 2024, with little-known former intelligence chief Dick Scoof installed as prime minister. A technocratic compromise since partners balked at handing Wilders the job despite his party winning the most seats. Scoof had previously headed the AIVD, the Domestic Intelligence Service, and had never held elected office before taking the country's top job. PVV's Marjolaine Faber took the newly weighted asylum and migration minister role, putting the party that had campaigned hardest against asylum policy in charge of it. Faber would resign in 2025 after a court found her asylum crisis declaration unlawful, forcing the cabinet to rework the legal basis for powers it was already using. The cabinet declared an asylum crisis, a label not just rhetoric in the Netherlands. It unlocks emergency executive powers that bypass the normal parliamentary process. Ministers billed the package as the strictest asylum policy in Dutch history, a claim measured against everything that preceded it, and a deliberate break from the welcome first posture in place since the Refugee Convention. Whatever one thinks of the politics, the intent was unmistakable. The government wanted every lever pulled at once, not phased in gradually. Strict, in this case, meant reaching past the asylum office and back to the open border itself, the one piece of the old system that had seemed untouchable. In December 2024, the Netherlands reinstated temporary checkpoints on its crossings with Germany and Belgium, roads that had run without them since Schengen removed border posts a generation earlier. The Marechaussee, the military police branch responsible for border security, staffed the new checks at crossings, including the A1 near Bad Bentheim and the A67 near Venlo. It was not alone. Germany, Austria, and France had reintroduced their own internal checks, each citing the same public order exception, so the Dutch move fit a pattern spreading across the bloc. Germany went further, reinstating checks on all 9 of its land borders in September 2024, the broadest reintroduction by any Schengen state since 2015. Under EU rules, a member state can reintroduce internal border checks only temporarily, citing a threat to public order, typically renewing the justification every 6 months rather than declaring an open-ended closure. Officials framed the Dutch move as exactly that, a 6-month measure. It has been extended repeatedly since, each renewal treated as procedural rather than newsworthy, a signal of how permanent it has quietly become. Spot checks appeared on select flights between Schengen countries, adding friction to travel that was supposed to feel as unremarkable as a domestic hop between 2 Dutch cities and delay for commuters and cross-border workers crossing those lines daily for work. A temporary checkpoint is a patrol, staffed only as long as the exception lasts. What the government is building next is infrastructure, meant to outlast any renewal deadline. Lawmakers have drafted legislation giving border police standing authority for risk-based profiling checks, screening indicators tied to irregular travel, not stopping every vehicle at random. The bill, put forward by the Justice Ministry, would let the Marechaussee run these checks without reopening the public order justification the temporary measure now relies on. Critics have raised the worry that risk-based profiling can slide into ethnic profiling if the criteria aren't tightly written, a debate the legislation leaves unsettled, one courts may weigh in on. Amnesty International's Dutch section and the National College for Human Rights have both filed formal objections during the bill's consultation period. That is the real shift underneath the headlines, moving from time-boxed enforcement toward a durable structure that doesn't need a fresh 6-month justification every renewal. The stated target is irregular migration routes through neighboring EU states, not the everyday travel of citizens and workers. The lock was no longer being propped shut by hand. It was getting a permanent mechanism, engineered rather than emergency issued. If Dutch checkpoints are one gate in the lock, the European Union built another at the mouth of the whole canal, on roughly the same timeline. Negotiations on the EU Migration and Asylum Pact dragged on for years, since the 2015 crisis exposed how unevenly the burden fell across member states. Southern countries like Italy and Greece arguing that northern states like the Netherlands weren't sharing enough of the load. The European Parliament adopted the pact in April 2024, and every member state, the Netherlands included, must have it implemented by June 2026. The vote bundled 10 separate legislative acts together, passed after 5 years of negotiation among all 27 member states. The pact mandates pre-entry screening and biometric registration at the bloc's external borders, expanding Eurodac, the EU's fingerprint database, so a person's record follows them to whichever member state they reach, meaning people are checked and assessed before they're legally considered to have entered EU territory. The expanded Eurodac system will lower its fingerprinting age from 14 to 6 and, for the first time, store facial images alongside fingerprints. It also creates fast-track asylum procedures at the border for applicants from countries where recognition rates sit under 20%, resolving cases in weeks rather than the months or years a full claim otherwise takes. Human rights groups warn the speed could come at the cost of thorough case review, a tension architects acknowledge, but call necessary to make the system credible after a decade of mutual blame among member states. For the Netherlands, the pact is less a new demand than cover, a European mandate for the same direction its own government had already chosen. Layer that on top of the Netherlands' own internal border controls, and you get two locks on the same stretch of water, one national, one continental. The national controls target intra-Schengen crossings, the Belgian and German lines that once carried traffic without a second glance. The EU Pact targets the external frontier and how fast asylum claims get resolved once someone reaches it. The Netherlands' own implementation plan, filed with the European Commission in late 2024, projects roughly 300 additional staff at Dutch screening posts to handle the Pact's new intake procedures. Both systems apply by 2026, national enforcement stacked on top of European enforcement rather than replacing it. A person moving toward the Netherlands now faces screening at the EU's outer edge, and potentially again at a Dutch checkpoint further in. The Open Era's central bet, that Europe's internal borders didn't need policing because the outside edge would hold, is being tested by two governments at once, neither waiting for the other to finish. Whichever system grinds slower will define the border experience for anyone reaching the country, regardless of which holds legal priority on paper. Whatever that test decides, it isn't touching what made the country famous, a distinction that matters more than the headlines suggest. Cannabis coffee shops still operate under Gedoogbeleidt exactly as they did in 1976, and nobody in the current coalition, however hardline, has floated closing them. Amsterdam alone still counts more than 160 licensed coffee shops within city limits, drawing an estimated 1.5 million tourist visits a year. Tourists still fly in for those coffee shops, unbothered, because that industry was never part of the fight. Euthanasia and same-sex marriage remain settled law too, untouched by every government that has cycled through The Hague since the 2023 election, including the one built around Wilders' party. Those fights were settled decades ago. Reopening them buys no political capital for anyone, left or right. The lock only closed on one canal here, not the whole waterway the country built its reputation on. What actually moved is narrower than it looks from the outside, and sharper for being narrow. The border checks are built, at least on paper, to be temporary and risk-based rather than a permanent wall around the country. The policy shift sits inside asylum and migration management, a single lever among many, not a rewrite of the broader social contract that governs how Dutch people live, marry, work, or die. The Netherlands is not breaking away from Europe. It is moving in step with the EU's tightening pact, landing in the same window in 2026 rather than running ahead of or against it. The country did not shut its door. It built a lock it can actually operate, one that opens, throttles, or seals depending on what is moving through it and how fast. And that distinction is the whole argument this film has been making. Tolerance, intact, Migration now, Tiktalai managed. The coffee shop is still open. The euthanasia clinic is still legal. The marriage registry never changed a word. What changed is who gets to walk through the gate and how fast the state can shut it behind them. That is a management decision, not an ideological retreat. Conflating the two misses what actually happened here. That distinction is worth holding on to the next time a headline calls this a return to closed borders. Is the canal lock the right model for the most open country in Europe? Or did the Netherlands quietly trade a principle for a permit system dressed up as one? Tell me where you land in the comments, and if stories like this are your thing, subscribe for the next one.